sort of discussion. But normally, my classes are heavily lecture-based, right? I want to have more of a discussion, though, about what Nietzsche is getting at in these pages, because I think it's really interesting. And although he's kind of a crazy dude, a megalomaniac even, if you read his works, you'll get that sense. What he has to say, I think, is incredibly insightful, and it's a good way to kind of round off this ethics unit that we've been looking at for the past few weeks. So what I want to do today is I want us to actually do some reading from the text. I'm going to be trying not to write too much on the board. Rather, we're going to keep a lot of the content today vocal. We're going to have some sort of discussion rather than me just writing a bunch of stuff on the board constantly. So what I want to do first is I kind of want to give you an overall picture of Nietzsche's philosophy, who this guy is, the kind of historical context in which he's writing, because that'll give you a better sense of what he's getting at in these pages, because it's oftentimes confusing, right, what these philosophers are actually trying to say, what they're trying to get at. So Friedrich Nietzsche is arguably one of the most important 20th century philosophers that have influenced the Western tradition. As I kind of said before, he's kind of a strange dude, kind of a megalomaniac. He says at one point in his writings that the only people that can compare with him intellectually are Jesus and Socrates, which is a very bold claim to make. And so when we look at his writings today, we're going to see a lot of confidence, a lot of emotion, a lot of intensity, but that can also make it highly enjoyable to read because he writes in such an interesting prose poem fashion. If you want to understand kind of what Nietzsche is doing and what he's trying to get at, you kind of need to understand the whole history of Western philosophy. Now, we're not going to go through all that right now, but let me just kind of hit some of the hallmarks. Ever since the time of the ancient Greeks, the Western philosophical tradition has been on a certain trajectory that has been influenced by Christianity a lot. Whether you realize it or not, a lot of the things that you believe and act out in the world today, in the West, are very strongly based on the Christian tradition and on Christian ethics, morality, and philosophy, and on Christian metaphysics. Well, what Nietzsche sees himself doing is he's destroying all of the progress kind of that Western philosophy has made within the domains of ethics and theology and metaphysics. He says in one of his books that he philosophizes with a hammer, and we're going to see that a lot today. He is really breaking apart some of the foundational concepts and traditions on which Western philosophy is based. So he's going to criticize that actions are moral or immoral. He's going to a lot of what his writings do is they signal to us what he calls the death of God. So what he's trying to do in his writings a lot is he's trying to not only get us to understand the kind of cultural situation that we're in the early 20th century, but what that situation is, how that situation is going to influence the way society goes into the future, into the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Nietzsche correctly predicted that these socialist and communistic forms of government would result in the death of tens of millions of people. Didn't know how he knew that, but he predicted that. But a lot of what he's going to be doing in the text that we talk about today are criticizing these fundamental notions we have of morality and criticizing the fundamental notions that our society relies on for social organization generally. He's going to say, look, we have this idea of equality under the law. We have this idea of everybody treat each other with love and be nice. But this has, by and large, held humanity back. And so what we're going to see as we go through these pages today is Nietzsche's scathing critique of how morality and religion have made humans weaker and more stupid and more resentful. And he would like us to throw all of that out and become higher beings, what he calls the Übermensch, the overman, the person who creates his own values and lives by them, rather than being what he would call a sheep or a herd animal, and just living according to the moralities and views of others, including our family members and our parents. So if you want to have a good grasp on Nietzsche's philosophy, you got to understand a few things about what his fundamental presumptions are. First and foremost, Nietzsche is a naturalist. What is naturalism? Who remembers? What do naturalists believe? Yes?
I don't know if this is right, but I'm going to take a guess. Is it the people who only believe in like what is here, like what they can see, like the physical things? They don't believe in like a god or anything like supernatural?
Right, yeah. Naturalists just believe that everything in the universe is natural. There are no supernatural beings, there are no miracles. The reason, by and large, everything is the way it is because nature has played itself out in a certain way. Now, Nietzsche's going to go further than this. He's going to say, naturalism isn't just true. He also builds into his psychology and his philosophy Darwin's theory of evolution. So he's going to be an evolutionary naturalist. And he's going to say human beings and their moralities and their beliefs and their thoughts, these are all just products of evolution. That's what this stuff is. We didn't get, contrary to the Bible, we didn't get a set of rules from God that tells us what's good and evil. Rather, because of the way we set up our society in the past and because of the way evolution works, that is where our moral beliefs come from, and that is why our psychologies are the way that they are. So broadly, he's going to look at morality and he's going to look at religion to be just mythological fictions that humans have come up with in the service of some goal, whether that's meeting certain psychological needs or cultivating and exercising power over other individuals. Power is going to be a key theme that we see in Nietzsche's philosophy because his metaphysics is based around this view of the will to power. The way Nietzsche understands how the world works is as follows. Everything is natural, but there is a certain way that things in nature grow, evolve, and behave in their relationships with other things. Nietzsche calls this fundamental organizing principle that determines the evolution and operations of the universe the will to power. Basically, he thinks everything in existence, more specifically living organisms, all have this fundamental desire to cultivate power for themselves and exercise it over other things. That is what we're all doing, fundamentally, is we're all trying to cultivate and exercise more power in the service of our goals and ends. And that's fundamentally what we're motivated by. This idea has become very prominent in contemporary social and political theory. If you really get into the fundamental or foundational premises of critical gender theory, critical race theory, this kind of will to power view is central. This idea that the history of humans has basically just been a series of power games. Social groups vying for power, attempting to cultivate power for themselves and exercise it over other social groups. This is the way Nietzsche thinks the universe works. More specifically, this is the way Nietzsche thinks that life works. All life is fundamentally motivated to cultivate power for itself and to exercise that power over other living things. One more broad point about Nietzsche's philosophy that I think is going to help us understand what he's getting at goes back to this idea of Nietzsche philosophizing with a hammer. Really what he's trying to do in a lot of his philosophy is to break apart the presuppositions that we have of the way that the universe works. And he kind of does it in a rather dickish way, but he does it in a rather effective, powerful way too. He prescribes for us, instead of just living according to society's whims and wishes and the expectations of others, he prescribes kind of a rugged individualism that eschews the conscience, that throws out the morality that we've grown up with, and says, you should do what you want to do and live according to your wishes and your desires. And if that means kind of trampling over somebody to do it, well, that's the way that nature works. In order to break apart our kind of basic presuppositions, we see Nietzsche critique Christianity and some of the foundational views of Western philosophy in his books. And the reason why he is trying to break apart our presuppositions is because this is a process that is already occurring. And it's something that is going to continue to occur throughout the 20th century, and he's trying to get humanity ready for the next stage in their evolution. In several pieces of his philosophy, he calls himself the Antichrist. He says, one of my foundational reasons for doing all this is I am going to be one of the people that's going to help usher humanity into their next stage of evolution by throwing out all of that religious, untrue, supernatural garbage and getting humanity back on the path of increasing and developing their own capacities and developing power for themselves. Because for too long, Nietzsche thinks, these Christian and moral traditions have caused people, humans, to become weaker and dumber and resentful, and by instantiating these traditions in society and continuing to follow them, what we're doing is we're depriving the world of geniuses and artists and of true, strong men and women. And so we kind of see him prescribing some sort of rugged, stoic individualism in his philosophy. In one of the first passages we're going to be looking at today, he praises suffering. And he says one of the things that's wrong about these moralities and traditions is that they try to get rid of suffering. But, Nietzsche says, suffering is the reason why we have all the great things that we have in the first place. The only reason society has made it so far and become so advanced is because humanity was suffering, and that suffering provided the fundamental motivation to develop technology, to change things, to transcend our conditions and our struggle with nature. So this, I think, is kind of an overview of some of the fundamental parts of Nietzsche's philosophy. And as we go through the text today, kind of think about how these views pop up in some of the things that he has to say. There's so much more that could be said about Nietzsche. And every time that I teach him, I feel like I don't give students a complete picture of what he has to say, because there's so much in these pages. They're so dense. So we're not going to get through it all today, but I hope that we can touch on some of the more fundamental and interesting insights that he has to offer us and kind of discuss that today. So let's do it. Let's just jump into the first aphorism that we have. Nietzsche's style is such that he writes in these kind of like little pithy paragraphs or sayings called aphorisms, rather than writing long, drawn-out arguments that go on for pages and pages. One of the reasons that Nietzsche does it this way is because he was plagued with severe illness for much of his life, and he literally couldn't stand to write for long periods at a time. Which is why, at one point, he says in his writings that he can say in one sentence what philosophers take books to say. So there's a lot packed into these sentences because he has had to make them so dense because of the struggles that he was going through when he was doing a lot of his writing. He couldn't afford or take to spend long periods of time writing. So he packs a lot into these sentences. Let's look at that first aphorism then. I believe it's 225. You all have the text in front of you. Did you not bring the text to class? Can I get somebody to just read this? Who's got the text in front of them? 225. Just start reading it. Yeah. Just start it. I'll stop you. We're not going to get that far. Trust me.
I'm just so sorry. Whether it is hedonism or pessimism or utilitarianism or Jungianism.
Yeah, that's a hard word.
All these ways of thinking that measure the value of things in accordance with pleasure and pain, which are mere
Epiphenomena. That's a hard word. Yeah.
Epiphenomenon and wholly secondary are ways of thinking that stays in the foreground and leads almost everyone conscious of creative powers and artistic conscious look down not without decision nor without pity.
Perfect. Great job. No, you did great. Again, Nietzsche packs a lot into these sentences, right? So what he's getting at, or what he's trying to say in the opening lines of this aphorism, is he's setting out a particular view. He's saying, look, we've been doing things a long way for a long time. We have all these moral systems, and we've been looking at these ethical theories in this class, right? Utilitarianism we looked at. We looked at eudaimonism, which is basically virtue ethics, Aristotle virtue ethics, right? We're going to be talking about hedonism later, or living according to our desires and wanting pleasure for ourselves and wanting to prevent pain. He says, there are fundamental problems with all of these moral systems, these ethical theories on which we've based our society. They're built on a flawed premise. The flawed premise is that there is such a thing as morality in the first place. There is such a thing as good and evil. And so he's going to get into this aphorism. He's going to go on this thread in which he says, we people who understand there is no real objective good and evil, we look down on all of the people that believe in these moralities. Okay? We pity them because they don't understand the very nature of reality that they're trying to describe. These moral systems, in fact, you think that they would be good for humans. We've had them for a long time, but the history of human society shows otherwise. These systems of morality, utilitarianism, Kantianism, they actually function to worsen humans and make them weaker individuals. He says, look at nature. When we look at nature, there is no good and evil, right? The lion eats the gazelle. That's the way nature works. We don't say that the lion did something evil, right? The sparrow eats insects, right? We don't say the sparrow did something evil when it was getting its morning meal, right? There is no such a thing as an objective good or evil action. In fact, there is no such thing as morality proper. There are only moral interpretations of phenomena. One of the things that Nietzsche is trying to break us out of is this conditioned psychology that we've been trapped in, to view things as moral or immoral, good or evil. But that's not the way the universe actually works. Everything is natural. And in nature, there is no good and evil. There is only weaker and stronger. And so that implies something about how we've been doing society for the past few thousand years. And in fact, he has some pretty nasty things to say to the people who have been pushing these moralities down people's throats for such a long time. I'm going to continue on here, reading this. Everyone conscious of creative powers, he says, and an artistic conscience will look down, not without derision, nor without pity. Skipping down a little bit. Our pity is a higher and more far-sighted pity. We see how man makes himself smaller, how you make him smaller. And there are moments when we behold your very pity with indescribable anxiety, when we resist this pity, when we find your seriousness more dangerous than any frivolity. You want, if possible, and there is no more insane, if possible, to abolish suffering. And we? It really seems that we would have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible. That makes his destruction desirable. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? The tension of the soul in unhappiness, which cultivates its strength, it shudders face to face with great ruin, its inventiveness and courage in enduring, persevering, interpreting, and exploiting, suffering. And whatever has been granted to it of profundity, secret, mask, spirit, cunning, greatness, was it not granted to humans through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? What is Nietzsche saying? What's bad about these moralities and these ethical systems that we've followed, that have been shoved down our throats by the Catholic Church and by other religious traditions?
Is it room for suffering in them, which we need to learn, I guess?
Right? Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I feel like there's a lot of suffering in religion. Like, in the Bible, Christianity, or like other branches of it, it's like, if you don't, like, believe in a God, like, endless suffering in hell. Like, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of suffering. I don't know where there's not room.
Well, think about what these ethical systems prescribe, right? Think about utilitarianism. Think about deontology. Even think about Christianity. They all want to try to limit suffering, right? They're like, look, we should feed the poor, we should help people out, we should prevent suffering, we should make people's lives better and easier. Isn't that largely what a lot of these ethical systems argue for? We even see this today in our contemporary political discussions, right? One of the fundamental motivations for contemporary progressive thought is establishing social justice and eliminating the unnecessary suffering of minorities, right? Nietzsche is saying, if your fundamental goal is to abolish suffering, not only are you trying to do something that's impossible, but you're an idiot. Because it's only through suffering and trial and tribulation that we become great, that we strengthen our character and strengthen our resolve. So this desire to eliminate suffering is both stupid, or impossible, and misguided. Of course, this isn't all he has to say about these moralities and these religious traditions that our society is based on. Not only is trying to abolish suffering an impossible task and a misguided task, but suffering is actually a good thing, he says. Right? He says it is through suffering that humanity has been able to do all the great stuff that it has. Right? If humanity never suffered, they wouldn't have to solve their problems. Right? They wouldn't have to develop technology. They wouldn't have to develop clothing. They wouldn't develop the computer. All of the good things humanity has ever produced owes itself to the fact that the humans were trying to eliminate their suffering. Their suffering steeled their resolve and provided the primary motivation for strengthening their own characters and strengthening society. Suffering, in other words, is necessary for growth and achievement. He even says at one point in the book that these aphorisms are from, Beyond Good and Evil, that suffering and joy are twins. You can only experience joy to the same extent that you've experienced suffering, and vice versa. If you've always had an extremely easy life, you're not going to be able to have an extremely joyous life. So the heights and depths of joy are dependent on the heights and depths of the suffering you've experienced, and vice versa. What do y'all think about this view? Do you think he's right? Is he on to something?
I feel like he's right, as in the terms of suffering is what makes people who they are, because everyone is who they are because of their trials and tribulations and stuff, and I agree with that. But at the same time, I feel like suffering still is suffering, if you could minimize the majority of the suffering, I think people would be better off, and he thinks that would make them soft and stuff.
You still think trying to eliminate unnecessary suffering is a good thing?
You were talking about people starving, especially in the United States. Why are people starving? There's so much food here. We have all the means necessary, and housing. We have the means, so we might as well eliminate it. People are still going to struggle with their jobs and relationships, but if we could get rid of those things that we can get rid of, why not?
I think Nietzsche may agree with you partly.
Okay.
But I feel like what he's trying to get us to see is that the suffering that he's seeing, or this is his belief, and the suffering that he's railing against that people are trying to get rid of, is suffering that is caused because people aren't actually trying to improve themselves or actually trying to get their own. Nietzsche has a lot of contempt for people. a contempt for the vast majority of humans. And he has this contempt because he's like, you're weak and you're stupid, and you are allowing yourself to bow to this suffering rather than trying to rise above it. And so if you're starving, go out there and kill a fucking animal, okay, and eat it. Don't whine about not having food if you're not actually trying to get it. So in a sense, he might agree and say, look, if this person is doing their best to actually, ameliorate their suffering, then we should help them out maybe. But he probably sees the vast majority of suffering that's occurring as being downstream of humans being weak and contemptible creatures. Does that make sense? It's a harsh view to take, right? Of people.
It was a different time too.
This rugged individualism that he prescribes it's harsh, right?
Yeah.
It's strict.
I have a hard time kind of agreeing with this, because from his point of view, the humans are just trying to exert power. Does that mean like we're going to justify like what Hitler did, because he was just exerting his power over other people and do what he wants to do?
There is no justifying.
Like,
There is nothing to be justified because there's no morality.
but we're just
There is only what happened and what has not happened. What Hitler did, what Hitler did not do. Who Hitler conquered and who he didn't conquer. Throw out all idea that, this philosophy is bad because it allows us to justify people's evil actions. No, there are no evil actions.
Do we accept that is like just what was intended to happen, though? That was just nature taking its course?
It's what happened, according to Nietzsche.
And we can't critique it because that would be.
We can critique people maybe for not being as strong as they should be, or for being contemptible, weak,
Wait, what if they're being too strong?
whiny characters. No, there's nobody that's too strong. No, strength in nature is a good thing, right? There is only predator and prey in nature. That's it. There is only the weaker and the stronger. And so what Nietzsche would like society, or rather humanity, to evolve into is a race that recognizes the truth that there is no objective morality, and then actually tries to make something of themselves. It's very scary. It's kind of a scary view, right? He's trying to break apart the fundamental presuppositions on which society is based, right? This idea that there's right and wrong, that there's moral and immoral, that there's proper and improper action. No, there are only powers exerting their power on each other, and there's only winners and losers. The more evolved humans that are going to come after all of this religious and moral garbage that we've been touting for thousands of years, the free spirits, the Ubermensch, the Overmen, are going to be people that recognize that there's only stronger and weaker, and they get their own. And that these strong people, these geniuses, these artists, these heroes, those are the people who drive society forward, who innovate, who break down our conceptions of what is possible and impossible. It's a radical view, right? You wanted to say something, right?
No, I was just thinking about, I noticed that you guys say like strength and weakness, and like you're kind of using it a little loosely. Wondering what is your idea of what strength is and weakness?
That's a good question. Nietzsche will probably couch it in naturalistic terms. So he'll say, look, the strong person is the person that can face and get through suffering. The strong person is the one who perseveres and doesn't give up in the face of suffering and in obstacles. They break through the obstacles. They overcome them. They don't let their conscience or their morality hold them back. They're out to get what they want to get, even if that means trampling over somebody else's wishes and desires. And then the weak person, Nietzsche would say, is the person who whines and resents the powerful people for being bad and is a failure, and they don't test their will against others. It's kind of a mean picture, right? It's a naturalistic picture. It's a rather social Darwinian picture, right? The strong win out, the lose fail. That's how it goes. That's how society ought to be, he thinks, honest with themselves about the fact that that is how nature works.
I feel like he had no relationship with human beings to like actually believe this. Like he never had a girlfriend in his life. Like wow. Because like we are such social beings. You can't deny that like the relationships we have with each other and taking care of each other is a fundamental part of being a human being.
Sure,
this
yeah.
is just like
Well, there's nothing wrong with taking care of other people. What he finds contemptible is that he thinks we've been led astray by these moral and religious fictions that have made us weak and resentful rather than getting shit done. So within his philosophy, there's room for care and love. He loved this woman for many years and proposed to her a number of times, and she always said no and then ran off with his best friend.
he was just weak. He was just too weak, you know?
The other guy was stronger than him.
Yeah, and because, his father was a Lutheran pastor, and so he probably has a lot of Protestant resentment built up. He doesn't see himself as an Ubermensch. He says these are people that are going to come later. I'm just kind of describing what is going to happen, how humanity is going to evolve, or rather that it should evolve in this direction, because this is how things work. This is the truth of the matter. But yeah, he doesn't, even though he has contempt and derision for a lot of people, he doesn't see himself as an overman. At least I don't think so. He was still a megalomaniac, though.
I think that one last thing. I think he was kind of onto something, because I think it is true that we do have to suffer in order to grow, in order to thrive, and things like that. And I think if you're looking at it from like a moral perspective when it comes to like religion and stuff like that, I know that there's a lot of people that'll be like, like for example, mental health, right? A lot of people within like the Christian community will say, oh, suicide isn't a thing, or oh, like there's that like depression doesn't exist. Why? Because Jesus exists, right? So it's kind of like that's kind of being passive because you're really unhealthy enough because you're not even doing anything to take care of yourself because you think, one day Jesus will come back and all the things will be healed. But I feel like I'll be dead by then. I don't want to, it's kind of like there are resources and things that are in place because I think that even within like the Christian ideal of things like that, I think Jesus was pretty practical too.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, leave me your head and just have faith in me and I'll save you and do everything for you. It's kind of like, no, you still have to take a step forward and and that might come with suffering, but it might make you stronger in the end. That's why I'm like, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, or that's a quote or something.
Did you know that Nietzsche said that?
Oh, for real?
Yeah. He came up with that. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Yeah. And it fits right in line with his philosophy, right? And so, Nietzsche asks us to consider to actually reflect on why it is that we're moral, or why we continue to hold up these moral and these ethical traditions. Especially in the next aphorism, 228. In this one, he alludes to what he sees Western society going through in the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the things that Nietzsche talks about a lot in his writings is what he calls the death of God. He says, God is dead and we have killed him. And there's not enough water to wash off the blood that is on our hands. And what he means when he says this is that due to the rise of the natural sciences, chemistry, biology, physics, trust in the metaphysics and the ethics on which our society is based, which is fundamentally Christian in nature, people are losing touch with. They're having less trust in the reasons that we were offered for why things are the way that they are. And Nietzsche calls this lack of trust in these basic metaphysical and moral assumptions dissolving and leaving humanity in a state of nihilism and hopelessness and confusion and lostness. He calls that the death of God. He says Western society is going through the death of God. They're losing trust in Christianity, and these moral views, these traditions on which our society has been based for the last few thousand years. And that by and large, the fact that we're losing trust in these things is a good thing because they weren't true to begin with. But it's also a dangerous time for humanity. Because once your foundational beliefs are questioned and are dissolved, you fall into a pit of despair and confusion, right? Nihilism. Once your foundational beliefs are questioned and you don't trust them anymore, you lose belief in the structure of belief itself. You lose hope that there is any belief system out there that is going to be able to prop you up, to justify your existence, to give you the answers to the questions that you have. And so you fall into nihilism and you think nothing matters. All of these, religions are mythologies. They're not true. There's not a purpose to my existence. Why don't I just end it all? All existence is suffering. And we're just here. We're an accident and everything sucks. And what Nietzsche is trying to prepare humanity for in discussing this is rising above that existential condition. Recognizing that humans are the ones to come up with these belief systems in the first place. We can always come up with new belief systems to justify our existence and our goals in the future. We don't need these outdated forms of morality and religion. We can establish our own values. That's what the Übermensch is supposed to do. He establishes his own values and lives by them. And in his discussion of the death of God, in this aphorism, it clues us into a fundamental question Nietzsche wants us to ask ourselves, which is, why are you moral? Do you do good things because you really want to do them and they're an authentic part of your existence in the universe? Or do you do good things because you're a coward and you're afraid of what's going to happen if somebody calls you out on it? Nietzsche thinks it's likely the latter. The reason most people do moral things is because they're cowards and they're sheep. And they're not doing what they want to do. They're living according to others' expectations out of fear. They're afraid of what might happen to them if they overstep what society deems as appropriate. Each one of us in this room, at least according to the depth psychologist Carl Jung, is a monster. We all have the ability and perhaps the desire sometimes to go out and murder someone. According to Jung, who was greatly influenced by Nietzsche, we all have what's called a shadow. Those repressed images and complexities and traumas and desires that we don't look at, that we push away, that we push down. If we don't contend with our shadow side, with our monstrous side? Are we really moral people when we do moral things? Are we good people? Are we acting authentically? If I just do good things because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't, or I'm afraid of people judging me, am I really a good person? What is the fundamental motivation that you do? What is it? Are you living according to others' expectations and desires and wishes, or your own? It's a deep question that we get prompted with when we investigate some of these pages.
What if you do have those deep, dark feelings and urges to do bad things, but you choose to not do them, and you do live morally? Wouldn't that make you a good person because you're not choosing to bring that stuff out of you?
If you actually deal with your shadow and confront it, yeah. But who actually goes through their life contending with or facing those things that they repress, those traumatic experiences, those twisted desires, right? Those repressed images and themes? Do we actually spend time confronting those dark parts of ourselves? Or do we, most of the time, run away from them and not want to think about them? Do we deal with our own psychological forces and spiritual forces inside of us? Do we confront them? Or do we party and use social media and get drunk so we don't have to think about that stuff?
Are you asking, do we suffer?
No, I'm just giving y'all questions to consider. Questions that come up in need.
I feel like everything that you're stating is separate. Are you willing to go through suffering?
That it's a related question, yeah. Who's willing to go through that? Yeah. Yeah, most people aren't, right? Unfortunately for a lot of people, their traumas and their complexities are things that they struggle with their entire life. You know? But I think this is an interesting and good question to ask. And I think what Nietzsche is trying to get us to consider is the extent to which our lives are not our own, if that makes sense.
I have one more.
Do it.
Okay, so I got a fortune cookie the other day, and it said that when you only find yourself when you lose yourself. And I
When you
feel
read
like
yourself?
when you lose yourself.
Oh.
I just feel like that kind of was a good thing to add to what you're talking about, because that's basically what you're getting at is losing yourself to find yourself, and he's saying who's willing to do that, and to be able to question, there's some things that we have morally based, but I feel like some of those foundations and structures are kind of passive. If you grew up in a household of people that have a certain religion, they're okay, well, we're passing this on to you now, so just take the torch, and you take it without questioning.
Right. I mean, for a lot of people, they're children, right? When they're raised in a certain ideology or religion or ethical tradition.
So, of course, those questions might come up where you're like, what the hell am I even doing?
Right. Do we have the willingness and the strength to question our own convictions, like Nietzsche is asking us to do? Or do we just want to presume we know what's going on and we don't need to think about this hard question?
I think you should definitely take time to think about it for yourself. I feel like what makes a good person, you're naturally good, okay? You were put on this planet, okay? And you are a good person just because you exist. Now, what you do with that is up to you. If you're not going to live authentically and true to yourself, then yeah, what the fuck are you doing? I'd much rather be honest and be truthful. If I want to kill somebody, hey, I might just kill you because that makes me feel good. And that doesn't make me a bad person. makes me a person who has feelings and thoughts that are valid and acceptable. Now, the way that I go about it, now that's up to
If you
me
go
to
through with
decide,
it.
yeah, but I'm not gonna feel bad about it because I wanted to do it in the first place, you know? I might just do it again.
What you're getting at is actually one of the fundamental views that Nietzsche has and that we see in his writings, which is people have internalized morality and religion to such a degree that they flog themselves and they're like, oh, I had a bad thought, oh, I'm so bad, you know, like, oh, you know, I had that extra piece of cake, I shouldn't have done that, and they torture themselves like that. And Nietzsche thinks that a big reason why that kind of self-torturing happens, that self-flagellation, is that we've been conditioned into believing that there is something wrong with us. And that our base and our animalistic desires and tendencies are bad and wrong. But Nietzsche's going to say, no, they're not bad and wrong. Your desire, you know, to execute the person who cuts you off on the freeway is a natural part of who you are. And he's going to say, when you constantly repress those feelings and don't deal with them, that's how you become a weak, resentful person. It's hardcore, right? And so he says in 228, may I be forgiven the discovery that all moral philosophy so far has been boring and was a soporific, and that virtue has been impaired more for me by its boring advocates than by anything else. It is important that as few people as possible should think about morality. Hence, it is very important that morality should not one day become interesting. Why? Because as soon as people start interrogating morality, they'll see that it's a fiction. And then their floor will collapse out from under them, and they won't know how to live, and they won't know how to act. I see nobody in Europe who has, let alone promotes, any awareness that thinking about morality could be dangerous, captious, seductive, that there might be any calamity involved. He goes on to criticize these boring utilitarians, he calls them, who want to promote the general utility. And he calls them ponderous herd animals. None of these ponderous herd animals with their unquiet consciences wants to know or even sense that what they're basing their philosophy on is just a big fiction. Most people don't have the strength and the willingness to confront and interrogate their own convictions, their deeply held beliefs. Let's move on to 259. Nietzsche's got, of course, more spicy things to say in this aphorism, too. Can I get somebody to read 259? Somebody that has the text in front of them? Start right at the beginning and I'll stop you. You don't have to read if you don't want to. Does nobody want to read? Okay.
Refraining mutually from injury, violence, and exploitation, and placing one's will on a par with that of someone else, this may become, in a certain rough sense, good manners among individuals if the appropriate conditions are present, namely, if these men are actually similar in strength and value standards and belong together in one body. But as soon as this principle is extended and possibly even accepted as the fundamental principle of society, it immediately proves to be what it really is, a will to the denial of life, a principle of disintegration and decay.
Okay, stop there. What do you think Nietzsche is getting at here? What is he saying? Or what do you think he's saying? We think refraining from injury, violence, and exploitation, and placing one's will on par with that of someone else is a good thing. Right? We want to refrain from injuring people, from doing violent stuff to them. We want to have a level and equal playing field in society, right? Everybody gets the same opportunity, maybe everybody even gets the same shit. But what is that? What does Nietzsche say that is? Living life like that. When we extend that out to the fundamental principle of society, what is it? That last line. A will to the denial of life, a principle of disintegration and decay. Why do you think he thinks trying to refrain from violence and injury and trying to make everyone equal is bad?
I guess it's kind of like if you're trying to base yourself off of someone else's life when you're not really living your own life, you're just kind of basing yourself off of what someone else thinks or kind of what they do and how they think.
That's true. He's going to agree with that, but he's making a more fundamental point, I think. Think about how he thinks the universe works. Everything is natural, right? Why are humans here today? We're here today because our ancestors were stronger and they survived and they procreated, right? There's a deep evolutionary thread running through Nietzsche's philosophy. And he's going to say the way that we've set up society along these moralities and religious traditions, that we try to refrain from injury and violence and we want to have equality under the law and all this lovey-dovey stuff, that's the exact opposite of what life really is. What is life? Well, here he gets to this in the next paragraph. Here we must be aware of superficiality and get to the bottom of the matter, resisting all sentimental weakness, resisting what our conscience tells us about investigating this question. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and at least at its mildest, exploitation. Life is fundamentally appropriation, exploitation, overpowering. This is what living organisms are doing out in the wild, right? How does a plant survive? Starts off as this little thing, right? It grows through photosynthesis, extends its roots out, begins extending itself into other parts of the environment, taking over the environment in a certain way, taking resources from the environment for itself, right? If there's a sidewalk in the way, the tree roots are going to burst through it or they're going to go over it, right? They're going to overpower the sidewalk. The tree is going to exert its will, its life force over whatever is in its way. This is what lions do to gazelles. This is what birds do to insects. This is what insects do to plants, right? The insects are taking the energy and the matter of the plant for themselves. They're eating it. This is what life does. This is what life is. Life is essentially competition between all these forces trying to cultivate power and exert it over other things in the environment. Right? That's what life is, and that's what life does. All things are fundamentally driven by the will to power. We try to set up society in a way that directly contradicts that, right? We say, no, exploitation is bad. Getting in somebody else's way is bad. Injuring them or taking their stuff is bad, right? But this is all of what nature does. That's all what nature is it's a thing that exerts its will on whatever else is there, right? Since this is the fundamental principle of life, it implies that we're never going to get rid of exploitation. We're never going to get rid of poverty. We're never going to get rid of oppression. Those are all going to be fundamental parts of human society insofar as we ourselves are natural beings who have a fundamental motivation to cultivate and exercise power over other human beings. So all of this social talk of establishing the utopia, social justice, blah, 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 Nietzsche's going to say, no, that's not how life works. We're not going to be able to get rid of poverty. We're not going to be able to get rid of suffering. We're not going to be able to get rid of exploitation, because that's fundamentally what we're built to do, is we're made to exploit. We're made to exert our power over other things. What do you think about this point? Do you think he's right? Do you think that we're going to be able to get rid of suffering, exploitation, oppression, poverty? Eliminate it?
I think that, like, logically, we could. It's just because of the people who exist. Like, I don't think it'll ever happen, but I think that it is, like, actually possible. Like, I think that we could do it if we actually wanted to. I just don't think, like, we as society want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you agree with him that we're fundamentally motivated, at least in part, to exploit and try to master our surroundings and other beings?
Like some people are. I don't know. I feel like some people have
Well,
different
if you look at the way he's looking at it from a biological evolutionary perspective, right? Survival of the fittest produces creatures that...
He's not looking at one part of nature, only one aspect of nature. Symbiotic relationships exist. That is animals working together to exist. Like, this just seems like such a small aspect of nature, and nature is a lot more vast.
All right, let me play the role of Nietzsche, all right? Would any living thing be in a symbiotic relationship if it didn't benefit itself?
No, but you're also still benefiting the other by, I feel like
Sure.
humans live in a symbiotic relationship with each other while trying to kick some more. Because if you don't take care of other human beings, then society collapses and there's no society to exist in, and so like, we kind of have to all work together to. You can't just be on your own, existing as your own, doing your own thing, and just not acknowledge the fact that there's other human beings that are helping you get there.
Right? Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of like an ethics of care.
The person that
thing.
built your car now is giving you the ability to drive that car and go off and do what you want to do. It's like you can't. I don't know.
I think there's room in Nietzsche's theory for saying, yeah, symbiotic relationships exist. But the reason anybody is in a symbiotic relationship, he would say, is because the symbiotic relationship functions to increase that thing's own power. Right? The clownfish and the sea anemone. What's going on there? The sea anemone lets the clownfish live in it. That keeps it alive. right? Protects it from other creatures, allows it to continue cultivating its own power, right? The symbiotic relationship is ultimately done out of self-service, self-interest. Because we're all trying to get what we want, to have our needs met, to cultivate power.
I feel like my disagreement with him, I mean, one of them, I should say, is like the whole idea of power. Because like to me as a person, power is not that important. I know that some people like thrive off of power, like a lot of people who go into politics, like they just are like, I want a name for myself, I don't care about other people, I just want to be famous. But like, I on the other hand, like, I don't, like none of the ideas that I have for my life have anything to do with me like being in power of anyone. The only thing that I can think of is like wanting to have kids, but I don't want kids so that I can control them. I want them to like, I don't know, have a family. Like I don't know, like I don't feel like I need to be in power.
I feel like something we should have done maybe at the
Define
outset was
it.
define what power is. What is power? What does Nietzsche mean by power? He doesn't just mean political power, right? He's not saying we're all trying to be senators so we can rule over our districts or something. What he's saying is that fundamentally all living creatures are motivated to develop themselves in such a way or perform actions in the environment that let them do what they want. Maybe that's a good way of defining power. Power is the ability to do what you want. If we use that definition, then aren't we all after power after all the time? We're all trying to extend our horizon of possibility. We're all trying to continue doing what we want, and we're all trying to develop our capacities so we can do more, so we can satisfy more desires and more needs than we can now, right? Why are you going to school? To get a degree, because that degree gives you power. That degree gives you the ability to do more stuff that you want to do, right? Like keep yourself alive, like get a job, right? If we have that definition of power, is this a little more convincing maybe?
I guess.
I was just gonna say, like your rebuttal saying that you aren't really motivated by power still kind of goes along with what he's saying. You would just be considered like a weak human in his eyes. But like, I wouldn't say, like what you're saying obviously makes sense because you're not personally motivated by it. But would she still be like in his eyes? He would just say, oh, she's just one of the ones that's not going to excel.
Nietzsche would say that just because you're not conscious of you being motivated by power doesn't mean it's not happening. He's going to say, look at life. Look at plants. Look at animals. We're evolved from animals. So we're doing animal stuff in a more complex way. We're all trying to keep ourselves alive, continue living so we can do what we want. We want to increase our ability to do what we want. That's what we're all motivated to do, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. Yeah.
I really think because of the way he uses words and the words he chooses to use, when he talks about power, it seems malicious.
It seems a little malicious.
Inherently bad, but it's just a theory, so technically you could put your own definitions to things, so I don't think it necessarily has to be bad as the power-wise, like education means that power, but that's not a really bad thing.
Right?
So,
Right, yeah, power doesn't have to be a bad thing. Look, the only reason good stuff gets done is because good people have power. Right? If you don't have power, you can't do anything. So power can be an amazing thing. Depends on who has it. Right?
I definitely think that people are driven by the want for power and greed. And I feel like if you just replace the word power with money, like you can see that this is true in so many aspects of life. And so like maybe not necessarily looking at just like the want for power, because maybe not everyone wants power, like your regular thought of it. But like, if you put money there, like, why are we all in college? We want a job that pays good. Like, you might have those few people who are like, no, I want to be here because like I want to do what I love. And like, great for you. But like, the reality is, you could work like a minimum wage job and be happy. It's just most people choose that they don't want to because they want the money to be like happier, I guess.
Right. Right, and you can ask the people like, oh, you're studying philosophy because you love it? Yeah, that's great, but you're not going to take a job that doesn't give you enough money to live on, right? You know, so like, fundamentally, we're all trying to maintain and increase our ability to do what we want, according to Nietzsche. So yeah, he would say, the fact that everybody's after money, that's a clue that they're all after this underlying thing, that's power. Because money is kind of power. Right? If you have money, you can do a lot of shit.
I think that his definition of living kind of went back more to surviving than what we determine today as living. Like the one thing he said with the first line was that we like morally believe that exploitation is bad or stuff like that. But I think if we look in terms of survival, a lot more people would think it's okay to do these morally wrong things if they were doing it to survive. If I robbed a store solely to get the food to survive, I think it would be a lot more accepted.
Right. Yeah. So, even in those moments where we're trying to justify immoral action, we believe, or we have internalized the caveat that it's, oh, if it's to survive, you know, then you gotta do what you gotta do. Right? Nietzsche's like, that's all it is. You know, that's all what we're doing basically is reducible to we're trying to survive because we want to cultivate and exercise power. Yeah.
Then does survival always have to be like seeking after money? Could it just be to have like whatever your sense of fulfillment is in life? Because I think a lot of people, they die, you know, and they could be the most powerful people in the world and not be fulfilled, and then they commit suicide or something like that because they're not happy. Or I don't know. I know some people that choose to live in poverty and choose that kind of stuff for themselves. So I think that everybody is unique and different, and I think that everybody's experiences kind of shape who they are and are set to live. So you can't eliminate that being.
Right. Yeah, there are many reasons why people do things. You know, fundamentally Nietzsche is going to say we're motivated by power, but that can take many forms depending on who the person is. For some people, what it means to cultivate power is to be good in their discipline, right? To be a good artist, or to be a good philosopher, or to be a good student, right? Some people think they're motivated just to learn, right? They're like, knowledge is what I'm after. Well, why do you want knowledge? So you can do stuff. That's power, right? But yeah, the way that we seek after it, or the way that we live our lives, is going to be relative. Everybody has different beliefs and they do things differently. Yeah. All right, I'll let you speak. I'm going to start working on something, but go for it.
But yeah, I was just adding on to what she said. I feel like no matter how you look at it, like this kind of makes sense. Like even if someone's choosing to live in poverty, maybe the power of feeling free.
Right.
Like that's, or like someone chooses to live in their car and drive around, or live in a van and drive around. It's the power of being able to explore the world, or you know, travel and see different things. I feel like in every single situation, you can somehow tie it back to there's some type of power aspect to it. So I feel like this makes a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to be as a dick about it as Nietzsche is, but yeah. I want to mention one more piece of Nietzsche's philosophy, which I know you're looking at it and it looks very controversial, and it is very controversial because it has to do with how Nietzsche conceptualizes the strong and the weak human being. As he's been doing this whole time, right? He wrote a book called The Genealogy of Morals. in which he was trying to trace where humans got morality from, where humans got a conscience from, why people have certain beliefs about what is right and wrong, and what those beliefs look like. Nietzsche basically argues in that book that our moral beliefs are all just the products of evolutionary processes. But he goes a bit further than this. And he says, in all my study, even though I've looked at these moralities, I've looked at these ethical theories, he says, at bottom, there are only two moralities. He says there's master morality and slave morality. And by morality, he doesn't mean actual good and bad. He means there are basically two ways that people live, two ways that they see things. And he talks about this in 260. Wandering through the many subtler and coarser moralities, which have so far been prevalent on earth or are still prevalent, I found that certain features recurred regularly together and were closely associated until I finally discovered two basic types of morality and one basic difference. The two basic types of morality are master morality and slave morality. So all ethics, or all ways of being, fall into two categories. They're either a master morality or they're a slave morality. One of the reasons why he rails so hard against Christianity is because he thinks Christianity is an example of a slave morality. And following a slave morality is not good. And it's not a good thing for you. Let's see how he describes these moralities. In the first case, when the ruling group determines what is good, the exalted, proud states of the soul are experienced as conferring distinction and determining the order of rank. The noble human being separates himself from those in whom the opposite of such exalted, proud states finds expression. He despises them. It should be noted immediately that in this first type of morality, the opposition of good and bad means approximately the same as noble and contemptible. The opposition of good and evil has a different origin. He's going to say that people who developed and followed slave moralities came up with the conception of good versus evil. Master morality is the morality defined by the ruling class, by the people who have power and exercise it over others. It's the way of life of the people in charge who are exerting their will on others. The masters, he calls them. According to Nietzsche, it's the people who followed master morality, the masters, that are praiseworthy. Because the masters are strong individuals who believe and do what they want. And they don't let other people get in their way. And what they're doing for themselves primarily. They're driven by self-glorification. They want to make themselves better. They want to make themselves stronger, more honorable. They want to be praised. But they don't want to be praised so much that they're just going to bend to people's wills. All right? They're not going to get on their ground and beg for people's praise. We can contrast this way of thinking and being, master morality, with slave morality. If the masters are strong individuals who live their own lives and don't let other people get in their way, who do you think slaves are? He's not literally talking about slaves here. Yes?
The ones who do what those other people want them to do, like work for them or...
It ends up kind of being that way. Yeah. Slave morality is the morality of the exploited and the oppressed. Or morality defined by the ruled. The slaves are weak people. Weak sheep, Nietzsche might call them, herd animals, who believe and do what others want. And they invented the concepts of good and evil in order to exert power in a subtle way over the ruling class. Christianity is a slave morality, according to Nietzsche. It was developed by a group of people who were oppressed and exploited. And so they came up with a mode of thinking and being in which they could justifiably criticize those who were doing wrong to them, according to their view. They're driven fundamentally by resentment and hatred of those who have more power than they do. Nietzsche wants us to break out of whatever slave moralities that we're following. He wants us to become rugged individuals who do what we want, who don't whine endlessly about our sufferings or our pains or our problems, who don't try to use morality to coerce people, because that's a contemptible thing to do. That's a weak thing to do. If you're trying to get someone to do what you want and you appeal to their morality, you have to do that because you can't force them to do what you want. You're weak. And Nietzsche sees kind of the Christian tradition as developing and instantiating a slave morality which teaches people to be self-flagellating, weak, and to avoid putting their will on par with other people and competing. Is this a helpful way of understanding some of the ethical or religious traditions that we have? Do you think Nietzsche's onto something here? Is he just being a meanie? He says he's seen these themes in every morality that he's investigated. those who exert their will on others, follow through, get what they want, and who are strong, and the others who are resentful of what those people are doing and try to knock them down a peg by saying what you're doing is evil and bad.
I don't know. I feel like there's definitely a more practical way to go about like
Yeah.
theory. I think he was just being a dick because he has trauma.
He probably
I really
does,
think
yeah.
he was just expressing his bad feelings on everyone. But I don't know. I feel like there's some valid things, but I'm also really there's really no one answer.
Okay.
There's no one theory that's going to answer all the questions. I think someone has to like take all of them and kind of look at all the pieces and kind of use them all together. I don't know. That's just how I'm thinking.
I hear you. I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Did he ever say specifically if he had a master or a slave morality?
He thinks that these moralities not only show up in society, but both of them also show up within individual people. He would say there's a part of yourself that is driven to be a master of your own destiny and a master of your own soul. And then there's a part of yourself that's like, what you're doing is bad and we shouldn't do that. And we should be nice and loving. And he thinks that there's often a war in individuals between following their own slave morality or their own master morality.
It's like the devil and the angel on the shoulder.
Yeah, kinda, yeah. Yeah, except, you know, the angel isn't a powerful spiritual being. It's a vile, resentful part of your character that's just angry at the people who have power and they want it, but they're too afraid to try to get it themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the way that it seems like it's structured, it just seems like in society you definitely notice that there is definitely some kind of like control that morality or like religion and things like that kind of play in
Right.
our everyday life because that's what it was kind of created for, to control the masses, to kind of spin them a certain direction because maybe if we can spin them one direction, maybe it'll kind of keep, let's stay contained a little bit so that we can take measures into our own hands to avoid risk, to do that.
Sure.
And I think that you notice that even in slavery, right? I know we're not talking about slavery, but I mean, hey, religion was definitely something that was used to control.
Pacify,
If you
yeah.
can't, you know, you have certain people that you can't read, but that was like the first book for a lot of people, like of color. You know, to read is that was like that first opportunity.
And what does the book say?
A lot of things.
What does Paul say that slaves? What does Paul say that slaves should do? Nietzsche hates Paul, by the way. Nietzsche thinks
They should submit to their master.
Right. The slaves should submit to their masters, right? Oh, how interesting.
Right. But you submit to them to survive, I guess. Sometimes, or I don't think it's right, but that it's questionable. But I think that it's smart, you know, because if you trying to survive, we trying to get out this storm together,
Right.
all in one piece. And if you're not the one that's kind of holding the power in your hands, but you have to, it's kind of like if you're in a risky situation, let's say, I'm gonna use like if somebody kidnaps you or something like that.
Right, you might have to do what the kidnapper says to make it out alive, right?
Yeah, or at least you just kind of play, fill it out if you're smart.
Right.
You'll fill it out, you know, because you don't want to make them get all anxious and then all of a sudden they do something out of reaction
Right.
to what you did or said or something like that. I think there's a time you can play chess with it, you know what I'm saying? You just kind of just play smart. But I think that sometimes what slaves did was they kind of turned it around to make it something useful for themselves.
Right.
As
Right.
like being something that they gained hope for. I guess, I don't know. I know a lot of black people that like Jesus, so I feel, you know.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche has some insightful things to say. I think he has some questions that are useful to ask ourselves and to ask others. Of course, I don't agree with everything he has to say. Right? The kind of view that he prescribes here is a rather harsh one, right? Of reality, and then what we ought to do, knowing what the ultimate truth of reality is. Right? It's just the stronger versus the weaker. And are you going to be a stronger person or a weaker person? It's not a nice view. But let me just ask before I let you go. Does anybody have any questions or concerns or final comment they want to say about this?
Yes.
Okay.
I just thought about social constructionism in society and how we kind of play to that too, as a whole, because it's like that's where you get those questions you have, like, is this right, is this wrong?
Right.
Because there's social norms that have already been set geared towards everything, and you're like, well, if it's not geared towards that specific thing, you're like, do I play safe or do I become the master of my fate?
Right.
And
Right.
yeah. Okay, that's it.
Yeah. The fact that a lot of contemporary progressive theory is built on this idea that the way society and politics works is power games, right? They're right along with Nietzsche in that. Nietzsche would not like progressives nowadays, though. He would call them slaves because they're not rising up and just taking power. They have to say what justice and wrong and make appeals to morality, and he'd be like, dudes, just fucking take it. So he wouldn't have nice things to say about social justice advocates nowadays. But anyway, this is just a small glimpse into Nietzsche's philosophy. He's got a lot of other cool things to say. Don't let his dickish attitude completely drive you away from reading it. On Wednesday, we'll have a discussion day, so bring your questions, all right? All right, thank you so much. I hope this was interesting to you all.
I didn't look at the syllabus.
Have a good day.
Is there a reading
Thank you.
for Wednesday? Since we did this?
No reading for Wednesday, no? Yes.
You want it in 2 paragraphs.
Yep.
Does it have to be, because I already wrote it and I don't have it in 2 paragraphs, but like me putting in 2 paragraphs is like, it just can't. It just looks wrong, I guess.
Okay.
I could show
How did you split up the paragraphs?
show you. I wrote this.
I'll probably still see